Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It is 6 on the dot, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. But thank you so much for attending our second to last webinar in our winter webinar series. This month's topic is wasted food, methods to managing food scraps. And our very last webinar will be a continuation of this where we talk about feeding people, not landfills. My name is Gabby. I'm the Business Outreach Coordinator for the Chittenden Solid Waste District, and I'm joined today by Beth Parent, who's going to be helping to moderate the chat. She's our Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator. And then also waiting in the wings, I have Bruce McDonald, who is a UVM Master Composter. So just as a reminder, some housekeeping things before we start. This is a webinar and it will be recorded. However, your cameras will automatically be off as well as your microphones. But we would love for you to participate. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If it's something that we need to answer right in the moment, Beth will interject and she'll let us know so that we can get that squared away. And then if not, we'll have time for questions at the end. So feel free to throw things in there as they come and we'll either get to them right in the moment or at the end. And all right, without further ado, I'm going to get us started. So a brief introduction to who we are. We are the Chittenden Solid Waste District. We are your local municipality for all things waste and waste reduction. You may know us by some of our facilities. We operate 6 drop-off centers throughout Chittenden County, and we serve the entirety of the county itself. And in addition to that, we also own and operate the ORF, the Organics Recycling Facility in Williston, home of Green Mountain Compost, as well as our environmental depot. We also do a rover all throughout the summer, as well as own and operate the Materials Recovery Facility in Williston. And we also, in addition to that, have a lovely outreach team. So we're here to support you if you are a school, a business, a resident, a landlord. We're here to help and answer all of your waste questions. Why are we talking about waste today? Food scraps are no small matter, and you've probably heard a lot about food scraps, especially in the recent few years once Act 148 was passed. And there's a couple of reasons why we put so much of an emphasis on food waste. For starters, you're probably already familiar with the fact that composting or reducing your food waste can save quite a lot of resources. Turning food scraps into soil amendments saves resources in a way that's very similar to recycling. There's less need for fertilizer and it's excellent for the soil. Some people forget that fertilizer components also need to be mined or processed, just like any other raw material. So while it's always better for food not to be wasted, there is recoverable nutrients in that food material, even if we necessarily wouldn't eat it. On top of that, it saves quite a lot of landfill space. You might have heard recently that we only have one landfill currently located in Coventry, Vermont, and that handles 80% of all of Vermont's waste. The problem is there's about 20 years left before that landfill becomes completely full. And so it's really essential that we save as much space as possible in that landfill for all of the material that can't be recycled or composted. Before Act 148, a waste characterization study showed that about 26% of residential landfill waste was just made from food scraps. But as of 2023, a few years after Act 148 passed, the tonnage of food waste has decreased by nearly 13%. So 13% less food waste is getting sent to the landfill. And that really shows that we're all kind of doing our parts, but there's still more that we could be doing. And then on top of that, one of my most compelling reasons is that composting food waste actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing food waste is one of the main ways that you as a household can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. The EPA estimates that municipal landfills are the third largest producer of methane, and about 58% of that methane that's being generated at these landfills is coming from food waste alone. So that might not necessarily be true for our landfill in Vermont, but in general in the United States, over half of the methane that's coming off of these landfills is coming just from food waste rotting. And all of this contributed to why food waste was banned from the landfill in the first place. Something else that Act 148 did was set in place Vermont's priorities for food and food scraps. Act 148 set in place the little food waste hierarchy, I apologize, which basically outlines from most preferred to least preferred what we prefer to do with food waste in order to reduce its environmental impact, starting with wasting less and ending with composting. A few years later, in 2023, the EPA put out a similar chart, which is a different shape, but shares all of the same information, just showing what is the best and highest use for that food waste material, starting with wasted food and ending with throwing it down the sink or in the drain or in the landfill. We don't have that in our food waste hierarchy because we can't throw it in the landfill. But compost itself is nothing new. It's existed for as long as agriculture has existed. There's evidence of Neolithic compost piles, these midden piles of discarded shells, bones, and bits of food that weren't edible, actually being placed in a large pile and used to make the soil better for agriculture. So we've been really composting for as long as we've been growing our own food. And we've been improving on it slightly over the years, but really going back to that same process. Starting in the 70s, we really started to introduce new products and new strategies that could work for smaller homes. So not necessarily focusing on farms anymore, but things that smaller families could do in order to reduce their environmental impact or just make use of the materials that they had. We'll be talking about a few of these tonight, but it's important to note that just because something's newer doesn't mean it's necessarily better or worse. People can use one or more of these methods depending on what works for them. And in addition to giving you just a broad overview of each of these systems, we also have some examples that were very kindly given to us from some Vermonters who wanted to share what they do with their own personal food waste systems, talk about why they like it, why they don't like it, and what they've learned. And then we'll also hear a little bit later on in the night from Bruce McDonald, who is a UVM Extension Master Composter, who's going to share a little bit about his experiences using two of these methods. So I'm going to start with the thing that started it all, which is just backyard compost. Composting is a controlled and aerobic process. I like to say aerobic because your compost pile needs to breathe in order to properly break things down without attracting pests. If there's no air in your compost pile, it's not actually composting at all, it's just rotting. So that's a really, really important factor in the decomposition process. The end product, which we call compost, is a natural soil amendment that can be used for everything from improving your garden soil to erosion control. And there are a lot of benefits of this. Your compost can take most food waste, including fruits, vegetables, eggshells, your coffee grounds, and the filters, as well as tea and tea bags. And it can even take your leaf and yard waste. In fact, leaf and yard waste is essential to a good compost pile. But some things that you can't throw in your compost bin is going to be your meat, your fish, your bones, your dairy, and your pet waste. This is because we don't want to attract pests to your compost pile, and there are a lot of stricter standards when it comes to composting those products. It's not impossible, but it's not something that we recommend. So you can also get rid of your yard waste, but the thing that's excellent about a compost pile is it is incredibly flexible in terms of size, cost, and skill level. Really, you're not limited when you want to have your own backyard compost pile. You can put in as much effort or as little effort as works for you. And if you have more food waste the next year, you can just build a second pile. And in the end, you have a finished product that's great for your garden. But that being said, it's not going to necessarily be the system that works for everybody. Composting slows in the winter, and so you might not necessarily feel comfortable composting in the winter if you don't want to go outside to access your bin through the colder months, or if you're concerned about bears, or if you just produce so much food waste that your frozen compost pile can't keep up. It also requires a significant amount of outdoor space, at least 1 cubic yard of space, plus space for your browns pile. And if you need a curing pile as well, you're going to need a little extra room for that. And it's not completely hands-off. It requires some maintenance and some physical labor in order to keep a pile active so that it's properly breaking down your food. Like I said, it can be as much or as little as you want, but it's not nothing. But like I said, there are a lot of different options when it comes to compost bins. You can buy a prefab bin, you can DIY one, you can also use tumblers of various varieties. There's one that looks like the Death Star. So it's really just a matter of what works for you. Um, just as long as you shoot for about 1 cubic yard. I always feel like that's important to add. Doesn't necessarily have to be a cubic yard, but that is the recommended size in order to keep your pile warm. But otherwise, sky's the limit. Going into another option that you may or may not be familiar with is backyard solar digesters. Backyard solar digesters are a great option because they accept all food waste. So that includes your meat, fish, bones. You can also throw oils and fats in there, and you can even throw pet waste as long as your pet waste isn't bagged. That's always very important because one of the #1 things I see that people are doing wrong with their solar digesters is throwing bagged pet waste in there, which isn't going to break down and it builds up. There are some DIY options, although you're going to have varying success rates. So you're going to want to be careful and make sure that you're really following all of the instructions. And if it's not working, you might have to take it out and start over. And it doesn't need that much maintenance. It only needs to be moved once every few years, so you don't have to do too much to keep it going. The downside of a solar digester, though, is that it really doesn't give you any end product. A solar digester basically uses the heat energy from the sun to break down your food waste and to actually put it in the surrounding soil. So you're not going to get anything out of it. It might make your soil a little bit better, but you're not going to want to put it next to your garden if you're throwing things like meat or pet waste in there. It also requires some outdoor space, so it would require you to own a yard and have the room to install one. And it accepts limited food volumes. So on average, it's limited to anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 pounds per day at peak efficiency. And I say peak efficiency because it's most effective in the warm months. These green cone solar digesters require good drainage, near constant sun, and they also require a little bit of that good drainage soil in order to properly function. Now you can amend the soil around your green cone to get better results, but sunlight and standing water and no standing water is very important. And you will have to move it every few years or so just to ensure that the soil is not completely saturated. Vermicomposting is something that we also talk a lot about here. We recommend composting, but vermicomposting is an excellent option, especially if you have a classroom. Vermicomposting is great for apartments. You can do it year-round because it's completely indoors. And while you can buy a fancy vermicomposting setup, there are some great DIY options that are also available. And at the end, you do get a finished product, unlike a green cone that you can apply to your garden called vermicompost, which is just worm castings. There are some limitations. There's limited food waste that you can take. Not all worms are going to eat everything, so you want to stick to fruits, vegetables, eggshells, and the bedding, which is going to be primarily shredded cardboard, leaves, or paper. And then in limited quantities, you can add things like coffee, tea, pasta, rice, and absolutely no meat, dairy, spicy foods, oils, fats, garlics, pineapple. You can find a full list of that on our website, or you can also take a look at some of the resources that exist, but you're going to be far more limited in what you can put in a vermicomposting system. Something else that's important to note that I'm sure Bruce will get into is that a vermicomposting system requires a certain degree of temperature control. So it has to stay within 55 to 75 degree temperatures, so you can't leave it in your garage if your garage is prone to freezing or outside on a hot summer day. But you still get an excellent product that is amazing for your indoor and outdoor plants. And then next, there is the bokashi method. The bokashi method was invented in Japan in the 1980s by Dr. Tuero Higa. And the invention stemmed from an already super common practice of burying your kitchen scraps in your yard throughout Japan. Dr. Higa noticed that the food scraps that were being buried was actually a bit too acidic for the soil. And so he created this trademark process of effective microorganisms in 1982. Bokashi bokashi compost does not necessarily need to use this trademark brand of effective organisms. In fact, a lot of people have started to create their own DIY systems for bokashi composting, but it is still an excellent way of making or prolonging the life of your food scraps to preserve the nitrogen before disposing of them. This won't give you finished compost, but there are different ways that you can apply it to the soil in order to get some benefits out of it. It's great for apartments, and just like with vermicomposting, you can do it year-round because it's completely indoors. And it will take most food waste, including bones, fish, dairy, and your loose tea and paper bags. But you want to be careful of oils, liquids, or excessively moldy foods, which might upset the balance of microorganisms. And another great thing about it is it reduces your trips to the compost pile, the drop-off center, or like I said, there are some ways to incorporate it into your garden, just so long as you're not putting those scraps directly on the plants. So in a minute, I'm going to pass it over to Bruce. But before I pass it over to him, I just want to share one little quote about the bokashi composting system, which was provided by another UVM master composter, Emily Johnson. So Emily Johnson is a certified master composter who experimented with her own bokashi system. And she wanted to share that she experimented with it throughout the winter when she moved to Addison County in order to specifically decrease her trips to the compost pile throughout the winter and to limit the amount of food waste that she was adding, since it was a shared outdoor compost bin for her entire apartment building. And she said it was a very convenient and compact way to manage her food waste. But something that she wished that she had known sooner was that the bacteria was very temperature sensitive, that she had to keep it out of freezing temperatures or the heat, which was a challenge because she didn't always have control over that in an older apartment building with fluctuating temperatures that she wasn't necessarily allowed to control. But that being said, I'm going to let Bruce do his own live conversation about both bokashi composting and vermicomposting and share his experiences with you all. Bruce, I'm going to pass it over to you and stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you very much, Gabby, and hello, everybody out there in Chittenden County or wherever else you may be tuning in from. And thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'm very excited to talk to you about a couple of things I have done here in my house in Arlington, Vermont. So I have to say first, I understand that it is not quite on message for me to be wearing a hat that says compost is hot, because I'm going to be addressing two cold compost methods instead of hot composting. But I wanted to dress up a little. Uh, if it's not already clear, cold compost does not mean low temperature. It just means ambient temperature, because the microbial processes involved don't generate the heat that a 3 foot by 3 foot pile of compost would. While outdoor cold compost bins, you can just leave stuff to break down over the course of months or even years. Both of the things I'm going to be talking about do require some regular attention. So it is not a set it and forget it kind of thing. But they're pretty easy overall, and they're great for someone who doesn't have outdoor space but still wants to actively compost. So I'm going to dip into a few slides here, and we are going to start with a vermicompost. And there are some important things to keep in mind. First of all, very important, any old worm will not do. Sorry, I lost my spot. When starting a system, you're going to need to procure your worms from a reliable source, whether that's a worm dealer, or maybe you have a friend who's willing to divide their existing worm farm and give you a starter set to cultivate. Do not try to capture regular earthworms from your yard or your garden and move them inside. Those varieties will die pretty quickly in captivity, and your house will not smell very nice. Besides that, with several varieties of invasive jumping worms prevalent in Vermont now, you could also run the risk of contaminating your bin with their eggs if they live in your yard and unwittingly transferring them to your planted areas. Sorry, 1 second here. So there are two main varieties of worm for small-scale vermicomposting bins. Red wigglers are probably the most common, and a 1 pound shipment will contain about 1,000 worms, which is perfect for most home setups. European night crawlers are another larger species that are probably better suited for bigger bins, like the ones folks make out of large plastic storage totes or old farm troughs. Both of these species can live anywhere from 1 to 5 years, but if you keep them properly and you feed them right, they'll produce enough offspring to constantly replenish that population. So barring any catastrophes, they should be a one and done acquisition. No repeated need to buy worms. Worms thrive between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, as Gabby said. And with each degree lower or higher than that, they slow down more and more and more. If they go below 40 or above 90, you will end up with a very smelly worm graveyard. And there's a variety of options for worm bin designs. Some of them you saw in Gabby's slides, both homemade and store-bought. Many people build their own with some storage totes or buckets. There's a dangling bag system on the market, or you can buy a tiered upward migration worm farm like the one I'll show you in a few moments. But no matter what kind of home you give them, you need the same ingredients to start. Bedding, whatever you use, it must be moist, or you will kill off our damp little friends. You can use shredded cardboard. And for those of you wondering, how do I get shredded cardboard? Well, I think everybody gets cardboard in today's mail order world. And a 12 or a 15-page paper shredder will make that into mincemeat, and it's fabulous for worm bedding or to use as a brown in your compost bins. Also coconut coir, which is sold dried in bricks and you reconstitute. Shredded newspaper, again with a shredder. And at the initial setup, you'll want to add a handful of soil to provide a little starter pack of natural microbes to get the biological processes started. You're also going to need grit because, like birds, worms have no teeth. They require some grit to grind things up in their gizzards. They like having some rough surfaces to slough off their egg sacs after mating too, so it's doubly beneficial for them. And for this, you can use ground eggshells, azomite, which is a mineral dust, small garden gravel, sand, or seashell meal. And for grinding up those eggshells, again, having an extra cheapy coffee grinder or food processor dedicated just to your shells, really helpful. And finally, of course, the main ingredient, food scraps. Well, I guess worms would be the main ingredient. Second main ingredient, you can use almost any fruits, veggies, old flowers, houseplant trimmings, as Gabby said, coffee grounds, tea bags. Just make sure they're the paper-based kind and not synthetic ones, and remove any staples from those tea bags. Bread, baked goods, pasta, other starchy goodies, just nothing highly acidic, and no dairy, meat, fats, or oils. Not going to be eaten by the worms, and they're going to turn fetid real fast. A few overall food tips on your worms. Do not overfeed them. You may have read that worms will consume up to 30 times their weight every day. And this might be true, but that doesn't mean they're actually digesting all of that. That material also includes the grit they pass straight through, as well as their own castings, because yes, they swim in their own poo and they eat their own poo. So it takes a lot longer to fully process 30 times their weight in food. It also depends on the temperature. As discussed, they'll slow down considerably if they're not in that 55 to 70 range. So you have to monitor where they've eaten whether they've eaten most of the previous feeding before you add more. And don't worry too much about starving them, because they can get by for 2 weeks without fresh food, as long as they have ample bedding, which they will also eat as it breaks down. I jumped the gun on no stinkies, but nothing super smelly, like Gabby said, although I will differ on one thing there. Air circulates through these bins, and while they're usually odorless, unless you take the lid off and really get your snout down in it, some foods will make quite a stink while you're waiting for the worms to do their work. I speak from experience when I suggest not adding cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, or kale, because, oh my God, I wanted to move out of my house for a few days. Onions, another one to avoid. And Gabby did mention garlic, and I read often that that is not recommended, but I put a little garlic in my juicer, and having that pulp in the worm bin actually gives my bathroom a nice little garlicky smell. So if you like the smell of garlic, I'd say moderation. Throw a few trimmings in there. Another thing, very important, monitor your moisture. If you've got really sloppy stuff that you want to feed them, make sure you mix it well with dry bedding and grit first to make sure your liquids don't just drain straight to the bottom and then putrefy. If the bin is really damp and dank, leave the lid off for a while and let some of that moisture evaporate before you seal it all back up. And lastly, manage your leachate. Depending on how wet the ingredients are, some leachate or quote unquote worm tea might accumulate at the bottom. And as I just mentioned, standing liquids at the bottom of your bin will turn pretty nasty if they're not drained off. So keep an eye on that. I've almost never had liquid pool at the bottom of mine, just nice moist nuggets of poo. So it's all about managing that moisture to make sure that you get the proper product and that it doesn't smell too bad. Now, I want to show you just a little video that I shot for my nephews when I first got my worm bins when I moved into this house about 4 years ago, and I wanted to show them what I was doing. 1 pound of red wiggler worms are squirming around in there. So down here, this was the first bin that I put a whole bunch of bedding, which is like moist shredded cardboard or newspaper, and food scraps. And the worms ate their way through a lot of that, turned it into poop, and then when it got almost full, I added this second bin that had more bedding and scraps. There's little holes in the bottom, so they start migrating upward into the new bedding. And you can see, if I pull it up, look at all those guys dangling here, climbing up. And in here, you probably can't see as well. It's the shredded cardboard. Oh, there's a little squirmy. There's one. So they're still eating this stuff down here, but they're climbing up to take over the new tier. All right, so that's one of 2 videos, but in between them, I just wanted to show you, this is one of the tiers of that worm farm that I have in my guest bathroom, which isn't really a guest bathroom, it's really my laundry room. But you can see in that video that they migrate up and down throughout their entire existence, and you just want to really make sure you're only feeding one layer at a time. Only actively feeding. If there's a little bit of food still left for them to eat in the bottom layers, it's fine to keep feeding the top, but do not continue adding to multiple layers because they're just going to get confused and not actually focus on the area that you really need them to concentrate on. Now, one more short video that I made for the nephews, which literally gets to the bottom of things. So now I took the top part off. The second layer, this is all of the old stuff. And we should see, there's some of the worms. And if we dig down just a little bit, you'll see, oh, look at all of them down there. They're still chomping away at all of this. It's pretty thick down here right now. It's kind of hard to pull apart. Ooh, yeah. See, they run from the light, so they don't love it that I'm here right now. They just want me to feed them and then go away, which is what I try to do so that they can eat in peace. And one other thing, you'll see all this little white stuff here. That's mold, which usually you don't want mold in your house, right? But it's actually the mold that the worms eat. They
chow down on all of the different little funguses that grow on the spoiled food. And it doesn't smell bad at all because air is circulating and it just smells like earth. So, pretty cool. Can't wait to show them to you in person when you come visit Vermont.
And I'm pleased to say they did come visit Vermont and they loved helping me feed my worms. So it's great, great project for kids to also manage and maintain if you have kids who are in an environmental mind. So I have another topic I want to cover, but I want to ask first if anyone wriggled their way into the Q&A about any worm content before I move on. Hearing none, then let's go to Bokashi. You already got the basics on its origin from Gabby, but it's, the new kid on the block as far as our timeline of compost options goes. This is an anaerobic process where the effective microbes that you add to layers of food scrap work in a super low oxygen environment to literally ferment the scraps, breaking down the cell walls so you end up with a bucket of kind of mushy but still recognizable bits and bobs. And a really cool thing that you can do with this is, like Gabby said, you can throw in cheese, meat, bones, lots of things that you can't compost in most systems. Just no oil in this one either, or too much liquid. So the effective microbes come in two forms, a spray bottle of liquid solution or a bran inoculated with them. And when I'm done with the slides, I'll just show you a couple of those. And before adding any scraps, you need to season the bucket with a healthy spray or a dusting of the bran, and then add your layer of food scraps, no more than an inch or two, then another spritz or a dusting of the activator. And then the really crucial part, in addition to putting on a lid at the top, you need to compact everything down to squeeze out every bit of air possible, making a dense patty of your material under that top layer of bran. Then you'll want to cover that up with a layer of a plastic bag or cardboard or whatever material you can get in there that really seals the corners and helps block oxygen from reaching the food to be fermented. There's also leachate in this process, and commercial bins come with a little drain spout to empty that regularly because it does build up much faster than you would think. Since this is a fermentation process, believe it or not, that tea smells very reminiscent of sweet pickles, and it's full of nutrients and microbes. So you can dilute that down like 9 parts water, 1 part bokashi tea, use it on your plants, or you can pour it directly into your outdoor compost bin, or you can even pour it down the drain because all of those hungry microbes are going to help keep your septic system flush with good stuff. Each time you have new material to add, I like to keep mine in an airtight container in the fridge or the freezer until I have enough for a proper layer. You remove the lid from the bin, pull off that sealant layer, add your new scraps with another dose of EM, and then seal it all up again. If all goes well, you will see beautiful, ever-expanding colony of white mycelium from the beneficial molds snacking on the fermented goods, similar to what you saw in the worm bin. If things don't go right, you will find some black or green mold, and that's no good. That is a sign that air has been getting to your scraps. If it's just a few spots here and there, well, that's okay. Try adding a little bit more of the effective microbes and then seal it up. And it's quite possible that they will outcompete the rancid ones. If it's a lot of blue or black or green mold, it's time to ditch the contents entirely, thoroughly clean your bucket, and start all over again, which I had to do once and was a very, very sad time for me. After you've done the last layer, wait for at least 2 weeks, and then it's ready to go right into your garden or your compost. If you're burying it, make sure it's deep enough that the critters can't dig at it, and all of our subterranean friends will turn it into super fertile soil in very short order. You can plant right on that spot in another couple of weeks. Or you can mix it into your compost, but do not, again, from experience, put it in your compost tumbler. because that is exposing this stuff to lots of air. And once it's exposed to air, it very quickly gets pretty noxious. My next door neighbors probably hated me for a few days the one time that I added my bokashi to my tumbler. So there you can see it's, it gets this mushy, white, moldy stuff, but it actually smells like pickles and is not really a bad way to go about your day with composting. And a few things there I had mentioned. So Bokashi bran, it's just like you might imagine. It's a grain bran that is inoculated with the microbes. And then they sell these little liquid Bokashi spray bottles. So a couple of options there. I like the brand better, but six of one, half dozen of the other, really. And that is my spiel.
I am going to go ahead and put my screen back, but thank you so much for that, Bruce. I had actually a close friend who tried bokashi composting once, and she had been considering it, and then she realized that it didn't make compost, and she was like, oh, well, then what's the point of it? But there is actually a lot of beneficial use to it, even if you can't put it directly on top of a garden bed. So that's awesome to hear. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right. So just a couple more to cover, and then we will finish up here. But okay, and so now we're going to the biggest, shiniest, newest thing on the market, which is electric composters, which I have to use quotes, which can also be considered dehydrators. So unlike a compost system or any other system that we've talked about, the product of this is really just ground dehydrated food scraps. You can kind of think of this as a combination food dehydrator and blender. They're a relatively recent phenomenon to be used at the household level. And there are a lot of names and marketing that might imply that this is a product that you can put straight on top of your garden. But it's important to know that that's not the case. And if you're not careful, you could actually end up spreading mold to the tops of your plants. That being said, you can still use it. It's great for apartments, especially if you want to conserve space and you don't have room for a bokashi bin, which can be about the size of a 5-gallon bucket, or a vermicomposting system. It's a little bit smaller and it can fit right on your countertop. You can also use this year-round, and it takes most food scraps, so that includes all of the fruits and vegetables that we had mentioned, and meat, and fish, and dairy, and bones. So pretty much anything that you produce, with the exception of oils, fats, and liquids, and very large bones. So maybe not beef bones in your electric composter. And this is great for reducing the volume of your food scraps to limit trips to a compost pile or limit trips to a drop-off center. But if you wanted to actually use this in a garden situation, you can try burying it. And I have another quote coming up that will explain a little bit more about that. They do tend to have a higher price tag, which is one of the additional costs. And unlike the other options that we mentioned, there's really no DIY alternative for this just yet. But that being said, there are a lot of good reasons to use it if it's what works best for you. And it can actually take anywhere from a couple of hours to almost a full day, about 20 hours, for you to actually process that material into its finished product. So by far, it's definitely the quickest option if speed is of the essence. And so we recently heard from 2 master composters. This is just a local expert, but still highly valued opinion. She had used electric composters for years, located here in Vermont. And while the material that she is produced isn't technically compost, she still found it incredibly useful. She wanted to highlight that the final product depends entirely on the composition of the food scraps that you put in the actual machine. So wet ingredients will have a very moist output, which might not be what you want for adding to your garden, but she always preferred to feed it to her chickens or she would bury it to let it decompose naturally. And then if it's drier, she mixes it into her indoor plants or her outdoor garden soil, which is excellent, just so long as you bury it deep enough that it doesn't have contact with oxygen, because once it's exposed to the open, it could potentially mold. But she hasn't had issues with it. She personally avoids using corn cobs, corn husks, avocado or cherry pits, and very, very large bones because they can reduce the lifespan of the machine. And she also very helpfully noted that while there are a lot of different options on the market, what it really comes down to is the size of the basket. And so how much are you producing? If you're producing a lot, you want to make sure that it's big enough to accommodate that. And then just the usability of the design. So if you have a preference for a certain style, or if you have aesthetic preferences, that might also be a reason, but they all function very similarly. Something else that she helpfully added, and I actually love this tip, is that she noted there might be a subscription for the charcoal filters that are included in a lot of these machines. And she noted that if you do not use or pay for the subscription, or if you do not use their specific products that go along with this machine, you may accidentally, unintentionally void the warranty. So always do your research in advance and just be sure that you understand what the warranty requires before you make that jump and purchase a specific machine. And then a great tip that I love, because I'm always about saving money, she noted that aquarium charcoal is an affordable alternative to buying the very expensive cartridges. And she actually adds this to her garden once it's been thoroughly used. So I personally don't see any problem with that. And I think that if it works for her, that's a great idea. So even if it doesn't produce a finished compost product, it can all be part of a unified system. And then last but not least, it's not the newest or shiniest thing on the market, but if none of these things are good for you, you can always try curbside pickup or self-hauling. This is great if you have an apartment or if you live in a place where space is constricted. You can do it year-round, and we accept all food waste at our drop-off centers, including meat, fish, bones, oils, and fats. If pests are a persistent issue, it may be good for you to either hire a hauler or take it to a drop-off center, whichever you prefer, just until the pests problem subsides, and then you're welcome to try again, or try a different system. And this is probably going to be the least work for you, but nothing is perfect. There are no end products when you hire a hauler, or if you take it to any drop-off center, or even to your community garden. You might not be able to use that product, or you might if it's a community garden. Transportation is needed, whether it's you getting in your car and driving it somewhere, or hiring somebody to come drive it for you, which might not necessarily work for you. And sometimes there are fees associated with it. If you take your food waste to Green Mountain Compost, it is free up to $30, or $1 per 5-gallon bucket if you take it to any drop-off center. So won't break the bank, but it is important that that is a factor. And we take everything, like I said, fruits, vegetables, meats, fish, bones, oils, fats, coffee grounds and filters, and loose tea bags and loose tea and paper tea bags. The only thing that they do not take is pet waste. You have to save that for your solar digester. And so last but not least, there are a lot of different ways to build your perfect compost system. Not all of these ways are going to work for you. Some of them you're going to try for a season. Some of them are going to be your go-to method for the rest of the year. But you can put together what works for you to build a hybrid system, or pick one of these that meets your needs. It's really a choose your own adventure, so I highly encourage you to explore and see what's out there, because there are so many different ways that you can manage inedible food waste. So first of all, I'm going to open up the floor to questions if there are any. I actually think I have a question for Bruce myself, but I want to say thank you very much to you, Bruce, and to all of the UVM master composters who shared some of their experiences, as well as local compost experts. UVM Extension offers an excellent master composting course. They also have a free helpline throughout the gardening season to answer any of your compost or gardening questions, and I will share that information information in the resources, along with a recording of this webinar and a couple of different other informational resources you might want to take a look at if you're interested in one or multiple of these options. CSWD will have our very last winter webinar on March 13th. And like I said, that will be on feeding people, not landfills. So focusing on that top half of the waste hierarchy I mentioned earlier to make sure that we're getting edible food to the people that can use it. After that, we're going to kick off Earth Month with a backyard composting workshop and Green Mountain Compost Tour led by Recycle Rhonda. It's going to be on a Saturday from 9:30 a.m. to 11:30, and you can register for both on our website at cswd.net. And I will also be sharing a link of that in the resources to follow.
Gabby, it looks like we do have a question. Catherine was wondering about a compost starter and whether it's worth the money.
I have some feelings on this, but I'll also offer you the opportunity to answer, Bruce. In my personal opinion, it's never really required to buy anything super fancy. Your soil already has a lot of the microbes that are going to make your compost system work really hard. And so adding extra stuff to it might help kickstart things, but really, you've got all of the ingredients that you need. It wouldn't be an essential part of your compost pile, but you're always welcome to try and see what works better for you. Bruce, do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I actually did buy a bag of that when I first moved here and tried it, and I didn't think that it really made that much of a difference. Really, it's just sort of a larger version of Bokashi brand because it also has that lactic smell, lactic acid odor. But the one thing I will say as the compost starter in a bin, not totally non-essential. My understanding of the little experience I've had with green cones is that the activator powder that comes with those, you definitely want to use at the very least when you kick it off, but also that it helps continue the digestion, especially if you're adding a lot of things in there. So the green cone is not always completely self-sufficient, and that's why they give you the little bag of what you don't want to get pulled over by the state police with an unlabeled bag of because it looks like other things.
Thanks. And that actually is a great point. I completely forgot to mention that the starter is required for the green cone, just as an extra thing that you'll need to grab. And kind of bringing myself into my next question, Bokashi bran, you had mentioned that that's something that you can purchase in the store. I know that that's something that you can also DIY, but it's a little bit more advanced. In general, it seems like it requires some kind of a wheat bran as well as a carbohydrate like a sugar, a water, and then possibly some essential microbes, which you will either have to purchase or some people try to cultivate their own specific strands. But do you have any experience with that, or have you tried both or just purchasing them?
Just purchasing the bran and the liquid variety. The problem I will say with Bokashi activators, the essential microbes or efficient microbes, is that they have a shelf life like any other living organism. So you can't just let it sit on a shelf for 4 years and then expect that it's going to still work. But there is an odor. So that's a good thing about the bran in particular. I don't know. Oh, here it is. I'm going to see if this sample that I've used for a bunch of presentations, oh yeah, still smells very much ready to go to work. But yeah, my favorite garden podcaster tried making his own microbes to to inoculate his own bran, and it was, he tried the whole from scratch route of leaving some milk out, or I don't know the exact process, but yeah, and he did not enjoy it. He ended up saying, yeah, I would just buy it from now on.
Definitely seems like it's a more hardcore option, but I always like that there are so many DIY alternatives to a lot of things that would be normally quite expensive to purchase commercially. Compost bins can be made relatively easy. Digesters can be made relatively easily. Everything pretty much with the exception of the electric composters, but as I said, there's something for everybody.
Gabby, a question for you.
Mm.
Down here in Bennington County, our solid waste district every year or so does a sale of discounted compost equipment. Is that something that Chittenden does as well?
So we actually don't sell compost bins as much anymore, but we do have a workshop coming up where we'll show some great DIY options, and we are actually raffling off a compost bin. So if you're in the need for one or in the market for one, I would highly recommend throwing your hat in the ring for a raffle instead. And we're also raffling them off at some of our upcoming events as well. But no, unfortunately, we don't sell stuff like that anymore. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions coming up. If you need one more, now's the time. But otherwise, I'll have to say goodnight to everybody. And thank you again so much for joining us. I will be sharing all of those resources in a follow-up email in the next few days, as well as the recording of the video, which will also be available on our YouTube page. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Bruce.
Thank you. It was fun.
Have a good night.